Hey folks, this is Clayton Collins, your host for the Housing News podcast. And one of the best parts about podcasts is you get a little glimpse into the real life and real personality of the guests of each episode and the host. And what you're getting from me this week is week 3 of pretty terrible seasonal allergies here in Dallas. I joked about it last week, but they continue to drive me crazy. So please excuse me if I'm a little off my game today. But it's hard to be off your game when you have a guest that is as smart, as lively and entertaining as today's guest, Leigh Brown. Leigh is the broker owner of Community One Real Estate in Charlotte, North Carolina, an independent brokerage which she started about 3 years ago. But she's been in the real estate industry for about 23 years, and anyone who is involved in the National Association of Realtors or the North Carolina Association of Realtors or listens to podcasts is probably pretty familiar with Leigh. Leigh is also the host of Crazy Shit in Real Estate, where she has some of the most entertaining guests in real estate come on and share stories and expertise. It is a fun listen, and we really recommend that you check it out. But in today's episode of Housing News, we focus in on some of the expertise that Leigh has built up through her 23 years as a real estate broker and agent, stuff she's learned from the Crazy Shit in Real Estate podcast, and some of her learnings as being involved in the National Association of Realtors and other trade orgs and events across the industry. This is a information-packed episode with Leigh Brown, and she delivers information in a very entertaining and informative way. That is why we're bringing her to the stage this summer at the Gathering of Eagles, our Real Trends event focused on the things that are happening in the real estate brokerage market and how folks are building really impressive businesses by thinking of their businesses like entrepreneurs instead of just an agent or a broker. It's a really cool group and a really incredible conference, and we're excited to have Leigh on stage. But today, I really hope you enjoyed this episode with Leigh Brown. You're leading me right into the topics I wanted to talk about today, Leigh. It's fun interviewing another podcast host. The only thing I'm going to have to work on here is to make sure you just don't turn all the questions around on me. I'm going to focus on you. So in addition to being a real estate agent and broker, and the list of involvement and accomplishments goes on, we're going to get into some of those. But let's talk about your podcast first. You're a podcast host, Crazy Shit in Real Estate. Give us a little glimpse into why you started the podcast. You were early on the content train. So tell us about why you wanted to start this show 8 seasons ago.
Can I first of all acknowledge how you were so hesistant to say shit live and out loud here in a housing podcast, which I think is,
Did I hesitate?
Yes, it was your maturity, frankly, showing, and that you're grown up.
I hesitated when you spoke at Engage Marketing, I think in 2018, when we brought that event to Charlotte. We definitely hesitated to say shit on stage then, but I think I've gotten less mature. Well, maybe not fully to your level yet, though. I'm working on it.
I mean, you've realized it's just a noun, and it can also be a verb, and it's kind of an all-purpose, relaxed word now. But the truth behind it is I wanted that in the title so I could have that little black box with the E in it for explicit language, and that's why it's on my podcast, which I find to be hilarious. Because I thought that would give me credibility with my teenagers. I'm always struggling with being a middle-aged mom. I thought that was going to be the hook. But as it turns out, they really don't care what I do. Sad horns. But the whole episode came out of all the networking that I do with realtors. And every time you're at a cocktail party, somebody's, y'all are never going to believe what happened to me today. And then they proceed to tell a story. And if you watch the little circle, everybody else in the circle is like, just finish talking because I can beat that. And the minute they take a breath, the other was like, well, that might have happened to you. But let me tell you this. And they always wind up with these war stories. And I was thinking, this is the best part of real estate. And we seldom tell it out loud. We tell it to one another. And then the public is shocked and surprised whenever they're conducting real estate and they stumble into a weird scenario and they think they're the only ones. And so there's this current of, it's the stories that people are fascinated by, and it creates a better reality check for what you might be going into. But then the other thing I wanted to showcase was how professional realtors manage all of these wild scenarios. And what do you do when everything's gone crazy? And one of the episodes I just recorded was with an agent who had to go to the jailhouse to get the paperwork signed because her client was incarcerated. And she's just talking about it so matter of fact, I had to go to jail and get the paperwork signed. And the public, when I get a response from this, it's always, oh my gosh, for real? And they're just so entertained and surprised by it. But I find that it's an undervalued skill of a great realtor is they really can manage anything that comes their way. And then they drink and talk about it later. It's just fascinating to me. And I love us.
Yeah, I heard one of your episodes where you were, and I apologize, I forget her name, but you were interviewing a woman who used to be a social worker, and she became a real estate agent probably, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, and was doing social work beforehand. She was talking about how she used to work with cancer patients and divorced parents, people going through like the hardest times in their life. And you jumped right in with, well, isn't that freakishly similar to what you do as a real estate agent?
And that's why she's so good at it. I mean, she's a
Yeah.
wildly skilled realtor, and you start thinking about the situations we land in, and it's no different with every mortgage lender because the story that a lender puts online in that online application is not always the real story about the finances until you make it 3 phone calls and say, okay, you made up all of this. We got to go back to square one, buddy. What's going on here? And the same thing happens with realtors. And you think about it, it's actually a marker of terrible TV production that HGTV has gone after the easy side of real estate.
The
They would
luxury,
probably
yeah,
for
like the
their viewing
luxury cash buyer
frequency,
side.
right? I mean, go for the crazy. And it's
Yeah.
everywhere. It's very plentiful.
All right. So let's hear, can you share some of these crazies? Like, what's like the craziest home buyer, home seller story you've heard of? Like, let's talk about like the client side for a minute,
Well, that I've
or at
heard
least
of,
from your
or that
favorite
I've
podcast episode.
Well, my favorite podcast episode is one of my dear friends, Steve Westmark. He's from Minnesota, and he has been an icon in the business for decades. I mean, the man is a survivor, and he's just a delight. And there's a story he's told for years, and it's tough to match the fact he was holding an open house for a listing for a seller, and he got there at noon, like a realtor does. You ring the doorbell, you holler, nobody responded. And so he goes to cut the lights on and set up the cookies and the water and get it prepared for the open. The master bedroom door is shut. No big deal. That's not the main part. Let's make sure that the part the buyers will enter is all set up and the open house starts and people come in the house. And then they discover that the seller is in the master bedroom and he's dead. And so Steve has to do what any good realtor would do and call the police right then. I'm having an open house and there's buyers in the house and in the yard and my seller is dead. So the police come. He, of course, has to stop the open house, but now he's a suspect because he's the last guy in the house when they find the body. His fingerprints are on everything because he was setting the house up. Then he has to tell the buyers, you're going to need to leave. And, oh, we want to make an offer. Not going to happen right now because we don't know who's going to sign the documentation. So he gets questioned. They have to take the body out. 6 months later, they're finally sorting out the estate, and he doesn't even get the listing because the heirs didn't want to use him because of the whole scenario. And I listened to Steve tell the story, and it's that could be any of us. It could be anybody. And frankly, in a post-COVID era, it's actually more likely because people are so disconnected from other humans and we live our lives on these little devices and you maybe don't see people in person. So would you even know if somebody had passed unless you went in the house? And frankly, I can't imagine having to walk outside in the yard and say to those buyers, hey, y'all need to leave because the seller's in the house and he's dead and the police are on the way to investigate. I mean, how fast would you scurry off that property?
We have a Slack channel at HW that publishes all the new registered users for our HW events, like the Gathering of Eagles coming up in June and HousingWire Annual coming up in October. I was just scrolling through the Gathering of Eagles feed on Slack, and wow, I am blown away with the quality of the attendees. Leaders from Keller Williams, Better Homes and Gardens, EXP, Compass, Hannah Holdings, Remax and Home Services, and incredible ecosystem partners like Zillow, Austin Board of Realtors, New Western Acquisitions, UWM, and Bright MLS, just to name a few. If you aren't familiar with GOE, this is our real estate brokerage event for the most elite brokers, teams, MLS execs, and state and local association of realtors leaders. June 18th through 21st in Austin, Texas at the amazing Omni Barton Creek Resort. Visit the events tab on realtrends.com or housingwire.com to register. He didn't like quickly update the listing to say like motivated seller, bring all offers. It wasn't like a,
I mean, had there been somebody to sign, I guess if you were in an estranged marriage where there was an ex-wife somewhere to sign, but just one dude by himself, then you have to get into all the title
yeah.
issues.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's a,
again,
that's
it's
a
things that
crazy story,
realtors
kind of
have
a
to know.
depressing
The
one.
public would have no idea. That was wild.
That's why, and I know, like, I mean, there's some amazing agents out there who, are often have the challenge of working with agents who don't do as many transactions or maybe don't follow the rules of the National Association. Have you had any episodes where kind of the horror story is on the other side of the transaction, not necessarily like with the home or the buyer or seller?
There's a few, but one thing I'll say about the guests I've had on the show, they come in with a generally positive, optimistic view on the business that you just pick up whatever slack is necessary because the other agents, usually their lack of skill comes less from malicious intent and more from just straight ignorance because they didn't land with somebody who could train them, or because they got into real estate with the bright eyes of I'm going to be rich beyond my wildest dreams after working an hour a day, and then they find out you can go broke so quickly in real estate if you're not even looking. And so many realtors work a day job until they feel confident enough to go full in that they're hard to get a hold of. And I think that agents really just are used to picking up the slack. So they've been more likely to talk smack about their own clients and their colleagues. And maybe now that I say that out loud, that's a poor reflection, but really it's a good reflection in some way.
Well, I mean, it's bad if it's just talking smack. It's positive if it's a reflection. So, like, how has the show shaped the way that you onboard new agents and the way that you train, the way that you think about building your business? Because I mean, you're hearing the best and the worst from your colleagues nationally.
I will say I think I've got a lot more grace and understanding, but frankly, that's also because I'm medium aged and I've been in the business for 23 years. And when you're early in your career, you're a lot more judgy of the public and of your colleagues. And when you get later in and you realize everybody's got something going on that can cause them to not pay attention or make a mistake. So I feel like I am a little more understanding than I was several years ago. And I'm always thinking, especially, well, COVID, I think, changed the perspective on that because so many people were trapped in a house with a spouse that they didn't know anymore. They were homeschooling kids and they weren't equipped to homeschool them, taking care of elderly parents. They were scared to go to the grocery store. They didn't know what to do with themselves. If you watch the mainstream news and the death toll is clicking, some people just got up to here in panic, and that can change your reactions to things. And then in the real estate space, in some states, real estate continued without missing a beat, like Nebraska, South Dakota. They never got put in shutdown. They just trucked right along. Here in North Carolina, we were out of work for about 6 weeks because we were not deemed essential, and it was a misdemeanor to be caught out working. So there was this fear factor. I'm going to go broke, and I'm going to die. And wait a minute, I'm homeschooling, and I don't like my spouse anymore. And people were here, and you realize you don't have the foggiest idea what's happening in their house. And so I'm a realtor, and I call and ask them a question, and sometimes they wouldn't answer the phone or wouldn't answer the question, and they sounded completely unhinged. And I realized it had nothing to do with me, nothing to do with the transaction, nothing to do with real estate, and just the sheer weight of what they were carrying. And I don't know that I'll ever forget that lesson because there's so many adages about, walking a mile in somebody else's moccasins, that old Indian proverb. And you start realizing that if you really slow down and think about the space somebody else might be in, you could slow your roll and be a little
And
bit
you're
nicer.
working with people in what's a stressful time in their life. And usually when people are buying or selling a home, it's because they're relocating or going through a change in their family, or positive news, they're upgrading, or negative news, they're downsizing. It's a interesting and like kind of tough emotional pivot point for people when they're buying or selling houses. And agents see their buyers and sellers at their their worst and their best. I remember our agent we've worked with several times here in Dallas. His name's Kyle. He was at Briggs, and we started working with him. He's at Compass now. We had a house listed with him in February and March 2020. And I remember like my wife sending him texts like, hey, should we like maybe ask people to wear like slippers or like a face mask or something. And he's like, I don't know. We haven't like that people hadn't thought about that yet. And like, we were like working through like everyone's like own kind of craziness and uncertainty at that crazy time in 2020.
And that's so funny you mentioned that, because realtors are very good at adapting. And I think that was where we actually led the way with a lot of people like, you know what, we don't know. So let's just go ahead and throw on some booties, which I think was my favorite rule that realtors had. Like the COVID never actually came in on shoes as far as we know, but we put booties on and gloves and masks, and we carried Lysol and hand sanitizer. And I remember going in a house and got my gloves on, and I didn't put the booties on because, full stop, one of my agents almost broke her leg on some freshly polished hardwood floors. And so I told my agents, I'm like, if there's a rule you can ignore, it's putting booties on, but take your shoes off so you don't truck dirt in the house. And I've got my mask on, I've got my Lysol, and I'm walking behind my buyers and I'm cleaning as they touch, and I don't touch anything, and don't breathe, and don't, and I guess you could don't use the bathroom and just hold it. Just hold it until you get to the gas station, because apparently COVID didn't go to the gas stations. And so you start realizing we were just in front of everything, figuring it out. And that's one thing I do love about the business. You really don't know what's going to happen next, because at that same time, I had some listings on the market, and the market went because everybody froze. You're in lockdown. Well, what can we do? And buyers froze, and sellers like, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? Like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And then about mid-April, the market went, and then it was just Katie bar the doors, and you didn't have time to breathe after you got a sign in the yard, regardless of COVID restrictions. But I will say the one thing we had as a rule that I hope stays forever, we stopped having overlapping showings during COVID. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So even if a buyer only got 10 minutes in the house, it was their 10 minutes, which for some people, that's all they need, just to look, process, make some notes, and think. And when you don't have that rule and it's just everybody can come in, you just can't, at least I can. It's too people-y for me as an introvert. I need some breathing room. So let's keep that in place.
It's like psychologically challenging for the buyer. They either feel like, oh, we need to move incredibly fast because there's other people here and interested, or they're turned off because they don't feel like they can really like visualize themselves in the home. So like, yeah, I think that's a positive thing that we've adapted for the industry.
And we should actually remind them that keeping pointy elbows is a gift in 5Ks at the beginning when it's crowded, but also when you're in a crowded open house. Get your pointy elbows out. Keep people away from
you. Do you have a list of advice that you give your home buyers before you start courting them around open houses and showings?
So much. I mean, first of all, we talk our way through what buyer agency is before we go anywhere near a house, because I want my buyers to be all the way educated. Who's working for whom? Here's where the money's going to come out of your pocket in the process. Here's what the market's doing. Here's how we're going to put a plan together when we find the house. And then when we get there, I'm like, look, don't say anything, because they could be watching. They could be recording. We found one listing had an iPad on voice recorder that was up under the couch, and they just let the voice recorder run. And you didn't see it. It wasn't disclosed. And I said, they are listening because these sellers just can't stand not knowing what you think of their sanctuary. And I think we forget that sometimes in real estate, because we just start thinking about, okay, it's 3-bedroom, 2-bath, built in 98. And we put the stats in our head, but to the seller, this is where, and you might not understand this, Clayton, but your wife will. This is where you take your bra off, because that's what signifies the end of the official day. And that's where you're most comfortable. So I want my buyers to understand that too, is they want to know what's happening. So you can't say anything, because you might tick them off and then they don't want your offer, or you might give away too much and then they won't work with us. And if you have to use the bathroom, most sellers understand the call of nature, but if we can hold it till the gas station, let's hold it. Because there is another agent story, speaking of my crazy shit stories, and she hasn't come on the show yet, but I'm going to call her name out if she's listening. This is for Gina Mays Harris, and she's right here in the Charlotte area. Gina has this story about IBS and in a house with clients, and it will make you double over and laugh until you are breathless and sick. And Gina, if you're listening to this, somebody tag her in and tell her to quit dodging me, because she said she would tell it on the show, but you don't know when that's going to happen. So I prep my buyers for that, and I prep them for the fact that some sellers say they won't be there and they'll show up. I prep them for the fact that the house probably doesn't look like what they saw in the photos, because we are hired as professionals to take really great photos. I warn them not to talk to the cats and the dogs and the birds and whatever critters are in the house. And then I also ask them, kind of joking about the booties, but my daddy taught me when I first got in the business, because my dad's a retired realtor, it doesn't matter what the cleanliness level is of the house. We take our shoes off when we walk in, because Charlotte's a very diverse cultural market, and some cultures don't want shoes on the floors. And you don't know who lives there, so just take your shoes off everywhere. And if you have a foot issue, then put the booties on or wash your feet at night or something. But I want them to be thinking through all of those little interplaying things, because there's so much more to the house than the bedrooms and the bathrooms and the square footage. And it goes back to what you said before. It's this giant transaction. It's the most money most people will ever spend, and it is intensely emotional. And I watch people get on Amazon and read reviews for a pair of socks, and you'll read 50 reviews. Do I buy these socks or not? They're $11 and the competitors are $10. And then they get so, I don't know, analysis paralysis. They just can't buy the socks. And then they walk into a house like, well, this house is great. I'll just take it. You're like, wait, you're gonna look at everything because we need to slow our roll here. But no, I just feel like this is the right house. I feel like my children want these bedrooms. And like as the young people say, all the feels come in when they walk into a house, and they don't go through picking it apart like we do small purchases. It's just wild.